Thank you very much for inviting me. Why on earth am I going to talk about rent? My reason for doing this is the obvious one, that presumably almost all of you are not homeowners, you are paying rent. It might matter to you, and it's one of the biggest differences between you. Depending on where you are in the country, some of you have struck lucky and gone somewhere relatively cheap and can live the high life, and some of you fools have decided to go for the southeast of England, which is going to be good for your livers and everything else, but you're going to be paying very differently. The more serious reason is that if you're trying to think of something that is of interest to people from all social science disciplines, then trying to answer the question, why is your rent so high, isn't just something that economists can answer well. I thought of doing something interactive, which we won't do, but I was going to get you to reorganise yourselves. So you tell your neighbour how much rent you're paying a week, and then we shuffle you all so that the person paying the least rent is down here, and the people paying the most is up here. And then we could do some psychology, and we could ask you fools up here, what on earth were you thinking when you agreed to this, and why isn't the market working? And apart from embarrassing you down here, we could say, how did you know the secret, and why aren't you telling the rest of them how it operates? But that isn't going to answer the question about why the rents are so high. Geography, of course, because housing is a spatial good. If housing wasn't spatial, you could have a wonderful kind of theoretical market in it that would work perfectly. But the problem is, if some people bag all the nice property near where you want to get in the morning, that does cause a problem for the people further away. And I could go through these things. I'm just going to give you something to read in case you're finding this too boring already. My argument is that rent gets really high when you get a high degree of inequality in society, because many things go wrong, but particularly because when the 1% are allowed to become extremely rich, part of how they become extremely rich is by charging a lot of rent. It's the opposite to what you may have been taught. I won't ask the economists to identify themselves, but if you did do an economics degree, if you do a British economics degree, one of the things you're taught very early on is that rent control is evil. You're not taught this in other countries. If you did an economics degree in Greece, for instance, half your economics is Marxist, the other half is what we would call conventional, which might explain what's going on in Greece at the moment. But people are taught very different things in very different places. This is what I was taught in the 1990s. I went to Newcastle University in the 80s, and somebody there who influenced me a lot was called Peter Taylor, who I thought was very old at the time, but is still working. You'll begin to discover this as you head through academia. And Peter produced a thing called, it's produced by Wallerstein and other people, but world systems theory, and he quantified it. And what he did was to take data on the top firms in the world and how closely connected their offices were in different countries, and then reorganise the cities of the world, putting them nearer to each other if they were closer in economic space, and higher up if they were more powerful, and came up with this image, which has the world economy spinning around the twin stars of London and New York. And I just thought this was a very interesting image, given that I was shown this kind of data such a long time ago. And if you think about the crash since 2008, and that, and how that's dominated our lives since. I've got another confession to make to you. It's not in the biography you will have been given. You've all done better than me already, because you've all been accepted for ESRC funding. When I was 21, I can remember getting a letter, I think at the start of the summer, saying I wasn't quite good enough, so I didn't get ESRC funding. Luckily, by September, some poor sod had fallen under a bus, and I was on the reserve list, it turned out. Anyway, well done. And that's a bit how life works, in a way. It is a chance. I'm going to show you 3 slides from my PhD, just for self-indulgence, but to kind of go to go from a very banal, bland, simple question to something more complicated, and to try and explain my nerdiness. It's okay, of course, to be nerdy as a PhD student. You're supposed to be nerdy. You're going to be made more nerdy. That is the purpose of putting you on a track to produce something all by yourselves, to give you a desk or a cubbyhole on your own, to tell you that you've got to produce an 8 or 10,000 word report by the end of the first year, and then an 80 or 90,000 word book that only 5 people will ever read. And not to talk to too many people, certainly not large groups of people, until you've finished. And then if you're really lucky, we'll put you in front of people to lecture them, which of course you're supremely unqualified to do after that point. My PhD was about data visualization, which was exciting in the late 80s because the computers only just started to be able to do it. There's a tree. It's a tree showing a structure of house prices in 1983 in one place. And the reason I drew that kind of tree is I wanted to draw a whole forest of trees to see what the country looked like. It didn't work brilliantly, so I'm not going to show you that. I'm just going to show you some of the more obscure things I was involved with. And the reason for doing this is to reassure you that no matter how obscure the particular thing that you're embarked on is, it won't be as obscure as some of the things that I got involved with back then, and you can escape from it. It doesn't matter if you spend a large part of the next 2.5 years doing things that are completely useless and you never use again and are a waste of time and turn out to be an error. Part of doing a PhD is producing the book that only a few people ever have to read to save people when you go on to produce a book that more people will read. It's a practice, it's a way of having a go at doing it. That strange triangle down the end is the electoral triangle. I got involved in trying to make it 4-dimensional, like a tetrahedron, in case we ever got to a situation where 4 or 5 or 6 political parties mattered. We finally got to that situation now, 25 odd years later, and the BBC will not touch my electoral tetrahedron for election night. And that's kind of complicated one. These are the kind of things I really like doing. I've managed to produce atlases like this. I've got a horrible, horrible feeling that hardly anybody understands them. But it's just ways of looking at large amounts of data and trying to look for patterns in it. And if you do visualization, if you're producing graphics at all, you kind of have 2 very different audiences. One is the audience who are going to look at a graphic for a very short amount of time, and they're the ones I'm going to show you next, the next kind of graphics. And then there are graphics you produce because you want to teach yourself something, because you don't know the answer, because you're looking for patterns. Here the pattern, this is taking out the average, is that back then children south of the M4 tended to go to old universities, Russell Group universities. So every year we had a kind of flocking up of southern children up to Manchester and Leeds and Newcastle. And the question was why that kind of thing happened. And it turns out it wasn't the low rents that were actually attracting them. And we're going to find out much more this year, because this year is the first year where there's a complete free-for-all for undergraduates. Any university can take any number of undergraduates and get paid £9,000 of them in September. Feel yourselves lucky that you'll be on this cohort and you're not the ones who are about to be experimented on. Okay, some simple graphics and getting back to what's going on at the moment. This is a very effective cartoon. It's effective because it's been reproduced so many times since the 1930s. It was actually drawn by a geographer. I wish I could draw cartoons like this. It was produced as a kind of protest against the austerity of the 1930s, when the argument was that everybody was stepping down, so it was fair, it was all okay. If you add 2 noughts to that, to the salaries, you get a pretty good representation of what life is today. If you put 2 women there, it becomes a bit fairer. If we give them newspapers to read rather than different hats, that might work, I'm not quite sure. how to do it. But essentially at the top we have the £1 million a year, and that would still be a man. And at the bottom we have people who are drowning again, and we're heading back to soup kitchens and food banks and rising absolute poverty. Now is a terrible time for British society. Now's a wonderful time to be a social scientist, particularly a young social scientist, because so many things that we thought had gone forever have come back, which means so many of your supervisors and their supervisors who are still working were wrong. They didn't think this was going to happen. They didn't see it coming. I worked with groups of people. We put huge amount of effort into studying relative poverty because we never thought we would see a group at the bottom actually having materially less again. It was all about, is the gap going to grow? Not will that actually drop. Just one table of data. When you get to my age, you still get your hands dirty, but only when nobody else does, and you sort of feel you have to do it. I'm sure one of you will tell me that this has been done far better than I, but I just want to show something I think is interesting, which is pretty easy to work out and quite important if it's true. You probably all get access. I do apologise to the non-quantitative people in the audience, by the way. I'm afraid I've been stuck on numbers for far too long. But this is pretty simple numbers. You get access as ESRC students to a whole lot of data that other people have to pay for. You don't realise it at the moment. I think one might be the SILK, the European, I've spelt it wrong then, I think it ends in a C, not a K, but the European Survey of Incomes. And a lot more. If you take all the households in these large countries, weight them by the weights in a sample because you've been taught to do that, don't equivalise them because that's all a bit of a mess, and find the middle household. The median household in Germany and France has a higher median income than the median household in the UK. And that's a bit of a shock to discover. And this is a higher median income before you take into account housing costs, which are much higher in the UK than Germany and France. And part of the reason I keep on harking back to simple things nowadays is that if it is true that the majority, certainly the poorest fifth of households, are better off in other countries in the UK, but even the middle household is actually financially better off in Germany and France than here. It's a bit of an indictment of this country. Our mean income looks much higher because we're so unequal and people at the top have so much. The amount you need in euros to get into the top 1% is 227,000 there. If you're single, as most of you probably are, if there's anybody who's secretly getting a trust fund of 160,000 a year, you are in the 1%. That's the level you're at. Your supervisor, if they've got kids, is in the 1% if they and their partner, almost certainly due to their partner, is getting more than £200,000 a year. And that may be the case in some of your cases. I had a strange addiction at one point in my career for sending social scientists their own surveys. So I sent all the I thought it was fair enough, they send them out. So I sent all the people who analysed the census form, to see how census analysts differ from the rest of the population. And census analysts tend not to reproduce, as the bottom line. So quite a sensitive issue when you get a bit older. Political scientists love the British election survey. They studied the British election survey. So what happens if you send the British election survey to political scientists? What do you find? The first thing you find is a couple of them write you letters saying, how dare you do this? This is absolutely intrusive. And you're very tempted to write letters back saying, but you've written 10 papers based on this. Is there one rule for you and one rule for other people? I was only asking for it to come back anonymised. The most interesting thing you find is not the political opinions of academics. They're fairly predictable, although there are more conservatives than you may believe because they hide the fact and always have done. But in the surveys, people are remarkably honest. The shock to me was looking at the incomes. And some of the household incomes were really, really large. And then I had a little look later, and this was the southern-based academics. It was the London ones. And it wasn't them, it was their partners. Their spouse tended to be earning a lot more than they were in a university, which was partly why they could afford to be in London. And it's all obvious when you see it. But I stopped doing that because it tends to upset academics if you shine the spotlight on them. But this is the idea that, you know, we're not neutral. We are influenced by our own backgrounds and where we come from. You come from somewhere very different from me. Most of us, the majority in the room, I don't know, 80% of you, maybe 70 are from England. I'm from England. But you're from England in the 1990s. That was when you were small children. Am I roughly right? Okay. And I'm from England in the 1970s. In the 1970s in England, we're here. Our 1% at the lowest point was just taking 6% of all income, 6 times the average income. After tax, 4 times. That means the top banker was getting the equivalent of £100,000 a year in the 70s. We were incredibly equal. We were the second most equal large country in Europe after Sweden. That's the country I grew up in. It affected me, it affected my generation. I think it was great. People tend to think their decades were great. A few people didn't like the 1970s. There tended to be people who lost money. And the only way you could lose money was by having a lot of it to lose, which most people didn't have. If you follow the dotted line here, you'll see that progressively we took over country after country, so by the time you were growing up, we were the most unequal country in Europe. So you grew up in a very different place. You may think this is just a statistic, you know, it can't really matter. But I grew up in a country where nobody really knew what a good school and a bad school was, because they just changed the school system from grammars and secondary moderns to comprehensives. And often, the old grammar school would be in the poor part of town, in the middle of town, and the secondary modern would be on the outskirts of town, which was new, but slightly posher area. And then slowly, over the 80s and early 90s, people began to work out which catchments were posher and which weren't. And by the time that you were young, they published league tables, and so your parents had an idea about which schools, if you're in the state sector, were supposedly good or not. That wasn't my childhood. I can go into this, but it really was very different. Parents didn't know. In Oxford, where I grew up, there was an assumption that the old grammar school down in Cowley must be good because it was a grammar school. It's now in the bottom 25 state schools in the country by GCSE results. There's an assumption that the school in the north of the town, called Charwell, must be bad because it was the old secondary modern, just we made a comprehensive. Charwell's now been named in Tatler's top comprehensive school list last week. But in between that time, there was a point at which we didn't know. I can go on, as you can tell, and on about this, but it was a different time. For children, it was a different time for adults, it was a different time for politics. I clearly reflect this, but I would argue that my leftiness and the rest of it is a lot to do with that time. My hippiness, I'm afraid, is due to the fact that my parents met in 1967, dragging a cart of flowers into the city. That is not my fault, but we are all affected by. I then wrecked 1968 for them. They didn't get to go on the demonstrations because I was in a nappy. Rent, back to the purpose of this and pictures. Pictures are really, really effective. This is showing some very simple data. The data is for the regions of England and the boroughs of London. And all we've done is taken each area, taken the average property price, actually the increase in average property price, multiplied it by the number of properties to work out how much the value of all residential properties risen. We might have been slightly cleverer than that by looking at detached and flats, but essentially the size of the area is the increase in prices in 2013. Now, if I show you the numbers, you would have one reaction, but when I show you this, you can suddenly see that London did increase in value by more than the whole of the North East, North West, and Yorkshire and Humberside put together. And at the time in 2013, people were debating about whether this was a bubble. And if you're trying to have an argument about whether this is a bubble, drawing a picture like this is one way of saying it does look a little bit like a bubble. 2014, we haven't got the last month's data, but 2014 is much, much more dramatic than this. We're still looking at 17 to 20% house price rises in London. Lots of evidence of a kind of cool down, but as yet no price falls. London's now become the most expensive large city on the planet. And it's just a way of trying to get over that this is unusual, this does matter, and it is very, very specific to particular places. Just back to inequality again. This is data from the UN. There's little people is comparing the incomes of the best off tenth for the population to the worst off tenth for the population for the 25 largest affluent countries in the world, missing out countries with less than 2 million people. It's a few years old now. The UN changed the director of UNDP, and the new one, who happened to come from America, decided he didn't want these statistics produced, so we're waiting for a new director of UNDP to come in to update them. But essentially Singapore, which is a very interesting country, is the most unequal of the rich world. The United States, which is far more important, is the next most unequal. The best off tenth of households in the US are getting almost 16 times more a year than the poorest tenth to live off. Next comes Portugal, which I suspect has, in my terms, got better. Doesn't feel better for the Portuguese, everybody's just become much worse off. But in particular, because the poor in Portugal has so little to lose, when people become worse off, the rich have to lose more, so inequalities in Portugal may have fallen, so I think we're probably third place. But the key thing is that we're more unequal than Israel. We are a really unusual country. You can see the usual suspects at the bottom there, Japan and the Nordic countries, and they're just very, very different places. And this really matters to you, and it matters to your PhD, because you need to think, for the next 2.5 years, if I was sitting in Oslo and doing this PhD, if I was sitting in Japan and doing this PhD, how would what I do be altered by that? To what extent am I producing something which is a reflection of the fact that I'm sitting in a university in Britain at this time, surrounded by these people, with this kind of influence on me? There's only one real way you can answer that question, or only one way I found you could answer that question, and that is to travel. After you finish your PhD, go and work abroad for a few years somewhere else if you really want to discover what the impact of being in Britain is on the way you think, and then you will see that there are different ways of thinking. Just a few more pictures now about extreme things going on in the country, and then please think of some questions to ask me. The book I did most recently is about the 1%. The 1% to me are really interesting because they're so varied. There's more inequality within the 1% than there is in the other 99% by income and wealth. And as you go up to the top end of the 1%, there's even more inequality. So the income and wealth, they're very different things. We know more about income than wealth, but the income and wealth distributions in Britain are like steps. And it's like going up to a giant's castle. As you go up from the lowest incomes, the steps get bigger and wider and greater and taller until they're absolutely enormous at the top. The blue area here is London. It's London sized by the riches of the wealthiest 1,000 people in the country, the half of them who live in London. So the size of the blue area is the actual wealth of the super rich. And the size of each of those circles is the wealth of those families at the top of the super rich in London. And those 10 families have about a quarter of the wealth of the 500 richest families. So if you're in the Sunday Times list and you're not in the top half of it, you've got to flick through about 30 pages and you find a little 8-point type of your dad's name normally. If you're in that list, you can easily feel squeezed between the wealth of people who've got so much more than you. And this is some of the best off people in the country. If you add 3 more families to those 10, they have a third of all the wealth of the best off. And that's where the wealth of the super rich is located in the country. And it matters for rents, I would argue, because it's been recent, this influx of people. And what it's done is to alter prices at the top in London. That makes prices that before appeared to be completely unreasonable appear to be not so bad. If you're only paying £2 or £3 million for a detached house, it's kind of a bargain in London compared to some. This has a pernicious effect across the whole country. So you can look at house prices in Cardiff and people will say, oh, it's pretty reasonable, but you compare the average house price to the average wage in Cardiff, and most people in Cardiff cannot afford to think about purchasing anymore, except in very poor areas. I can give you the extreme example of Oxford. The Centre for Cities recently showed that Oxford has managed to beat London because we have a lower average wage because we don't have London waiting. Just over a year ago, average Oxford prices were 9 times average incomes. Last Christmas they got to 12 times, and then a couple of months ago they got to 15 times average incomes in Oxford. Life carries on. For most people they're just simply unaffordable, but London's at 14 times. And when prices for property becomes this high, people feel justified in charging very high rents because they're trying to cover the mortgage that they bought the property with by your rent. But what you have to ask with all these rents and these prices is, what are they actually charging for? Are they charging for the fact that they built the property? Are they charging for the fact they've done it up to make it so nice for you to live in? Are they charging for all their effort that comes to managing it for you and answering your calls when you phone up and say, oh, I don't know, the blinds aren't working or something? Where's the money actually going from your rents? Who's actually making the money and what's lying behind it? And when you look at housing in that way, you see that these very, very high levels that we've currently reached in the southeast of England are largely propped up by sentiment. It's the idea that housing is worth this much. But it isn't just sentiment. It's also politics. If you look at what George Osborne has been doing since 2010, and you look at each budget, the majority of his spending in the budgets have been measures to keep house prices high. Help to Buy was the most dramatic one. Help to Buy means that me, and in a couple of years you, will be underwriting up to 130 billion of house prices, because if they fall, banks and building societies, if they repossess the homes, are not liable for the first 25% of falls in the price. We are. Help to Buy was a massive programme to make sure house prices stay high and rising. You can have other sides to it. It stopped prices falling in the north. The stamp duty changes in the autumn statement and earlier in the budgets, allowing people to buy property with their annuities around now. It's all about keeping house prices high. There are obvious political reasons why, if I was a Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, I'd do this, because I would want my party to win an election. But there are other reasons. This is showing a mixture of that and demographic reasons about why rents are so high and why we have a housing problem. This is the work of Becky Tunstall. It's published in a paper that came out last week. Becky is the director of the Centre for Housing Policy in York, and what Becky did was to take census data all the way from 1911 till 2011 and just look at the top line because it's the most dramatic. She compared the best off tenth of the population by how much housing space they had to the worst off tenth. In 1911, the people who were best housed in terms of space each had on average 4 times as many rooms as the people who were worst housed. Now what that meant in 1911 was the worst housed tenth was sleeping 4 to a room, the best housed tenth had their own bedroom. But you had that 4-to-1 inequality. That actually rose to 1921, and many other indices of inequality rose till around about 1918, 1921. And then we began to build council housing, and we began to reduce income inequalities, and all other kinds of things occurred. We built a welfare state, we added an NHS, and slowly we reached the heady heights of the 1970s that I love so much, when the best off tenth had 3 times as many rooms as the poorest tenth. That's what greater equality looks like. Still massive inequality, but a very, very different kind of society. And then you're looking at the end of the graph, or hopefully you are, 2001 and 2011, and something really dramatic happened. And this is a combination, I think, of 2 things. One is that growing income and wealth inequality that meant that some people could buy themselves more space, or a second home, or a third home, and so on. And other people were crowding into less and less space. And then we did the bedroom tax on them on top of that, having already pushed them in, just in case they had a spare bedroom. That was part of it, but that was only half of it. The other thing that happened in the 90s and the 2000s, and why this isn't just government's fault and why it's a bit trickier, is very annoyingly, if you're into allocating housing, but very good for the population, people stopped dying in their 70s and started lasting until their 80s and lasting through to their 90s. This is great for people, but it's pretty bad news if you've got a housing stock that was built for people to die in their 70s, because then they die very conveniently and leave a family house empty that a family can move into. Ageing the way we do it in Britain, because we don't have a cascade system where you can move out easily, means that we have an enormous number of houses that are occupied by a single elderly person who often complains that they cannot afford to heat the whole house, and they'd quite like to move, but they're not moving. And they're not moving for 2 reasons. One is that nearby where they live, where their friends are, or their remaining friends begin to matter quite a lot when you get very old, because they really do go forever. Nearby where they live, there isn't suitable property for them to move to. But the other reason, the absolutely tragic reason that people are hanging on in these homes, is because they're doing it for the good of their grandchildren, which could be you. Because the longer they stay in that property, the higher it'll go up in value, so that when they die, they can pass on a greater amount of money to their children and grandchildren, which will help them just manage to get themselves a house. You see how it works? We've kind of gone through, there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals and their families, which makes all of you and your families an individual little welfare state to look after each other. It might sound sensible, but if you all individually try to look after each other in terms of housing, you end up wasting housing space by doing it. I'm not advocating that we reinvent Stalin and just simply allocate the housing to the people who need it. I'm just trying to point out that if you look at that graph at the top one, something's gone wrong recently, and we need to worry about it. There's a relatively easy way to solve it. If it was very, very easy, it would have been done already. The easy way to solve it is if our house prices begin to come down. When Grant Shapps was the Minister for Housing 2 years ago, he said he wanted house prices to rise 2% less than wages. So if that actually happened, house prices would be going down. If house prices are going down, say towards the average German level, over 30 years, then if you're in a house that you no longer like to be in, if it's too hard to heat, if it's too big for you, if you don't want to clean it all, the quicker you move out of that to a smaller house, the more money you can leave your children. The longer you hang around in a house that's expensive, the less you'd leave your children. So there are lots of ways in which we can think of getting out of this. Because you're PhD students, I can inflict this on you. I normally spend a very, very boring 25 minutes slowly building up to this graph, doing one line after another. It's IMF data. It's a little bit out of date. The more recent data is more depressing. Again, from my point of view, not depressing. Let me try and switch hats, which is a trick I hope to learn in the next 10 years of my life, to be able to genuinely present the other point of view. So here's the other point of view. The UK was a terrible country in 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005. It was spending, this is a percent of GDP on public spending, it was spending above its means. Look at it compared to Ireland, wonderful country, or the USA, wonderful country. Okay, we're spending above our means. And the public spending's going up. That was really profligate, wasn't it? Very naughty. There was actually a little war then, which I think we could have done without, and I think would have actually taken us down here. But anyway, there we are, very naughty country, very bad. And look at this is a terrible increased spending. You might have a guess about what all this increased spending is. You can look at the date and work it out yourselves. I won't even tell you because you are immensely clever. I'll just tell you it wasn't scroungers. Well, it wasn't, well, anyway, there we are. There we are. Actually, you've got to adjust this. You know the EU have adjusted our GDP because they put in prostitution and drug taking in? Do you see that? Do you know who was spending the money on the prostitutes and the drugs? But anyway, sorry, I forgot my hat. She said I'm going to find this hard. Right, and then we get a grip. A brilliant, sensible coalition government come in, and luckily those Liberals who are truly awful managed to put a couple of millionaires in, Clegg and Laws and so on, and although he's not a millionaire, he behaves like it, Danny, what's his name, from Scotland, and they get a grip, and they get our spending down, and they get it down, 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 and look at that, 2015, massive success, we managed to get our public spending down below the United States of America. There's an achievement. We're the best in the world, we're number one, we're heading for something completely new, whereas all those other terrible countries, like Denmark and France and Sweden, Austria and Finland, just don't know what they're doing. Spending up to 50% of GDP on public services, letting children go to university for nothing, not putting in a proper market. I'll take the hat off now. But you see, I'm tempted to try to, I wish I could learn to do that. There's just a huge range, that's the point. There's a huge range in different countries of ways of behaving and doing things. And the world hasn't ended in those countries that do it more collectively than those that do it less collectively. Here's my quick suggestions about what I would do about rents, but I've only got about a minute or two before questions. I would end Help to Buy. I'm a boring middle-aged academic. I don't want revolution. I would end it slowly and carefully. It's going to be really interesting to watch the housing market events this year. If Labour pull ahead in the polls, I think watch the house prices begin to go down. We need to share out what we've got a bit better, but not in the social rented sector, which is already most efficient, and not by coercion. If somebody wants to have a 16-bed house on their own, I'm happy for them to have it. It should just cost them quite a lot to do that. We need 5-year tenancies. This is what is normal in much of Europe. 25% of our families with kids now are renting privately. It's shot up really recently. Nobody planned for that to happen. There's no reason why landlords need tax relief and other incentives. They are doing fine as they are. And personally, there are some nice landlords, I know them, but I really would use the criminal law on those who rent out housing which is below the standards you're supposed to do it. And I think that would be a big incentive for landlords to be more aspirational and produce something a bit better. Final graph, just about differences, something very different. I wish we'd have some more comparative work. I'm sure some of you are doing PhDs comparing different countries, but I just think it's one of the most interesting ways to see what the possibilities are. I like producing these charts which kind of imply causation from a correlation. And of course there isn't always causation from these, but the important thing is it's not a coincidence that these things line up. The question is, why do they line up? This is the take of the 1%. These are all the countries for which we can get cycling and walking data. In America, they're heading towards 20% of all income. It's drawn big because it's a lot of people. In the Netherlands, the top 1% are taking around about 6%, 6.7%. Over half of all people cycle or walk to work in the Netherlands. In the US, it's 3.5%. The fastest way to get fat in the world, if I showed you obesity, it's similar. If you're aiming to get fat, eating helps, but the better thing is just to drive a car in bad traffic for 3 hours. And even better, drive an automatic, because then you only exercise at 1 foot. My point showing you this, or what I think is an interesting question for social scientists, is these are societal choices. A whole society has chosen to have a road-based system. Okay, they had a lot of space, it was spread out. But it's a societal choice. In some US towns there are no pavements, so it's very hard to walk. Netherlands has chosen a different way. Denmark has chosen a different way. We have a choice. We could choose to move more towards walking and cycling and less towards cars, or we could build more motorways across southern England and have more cars. But it's a societal choice. You can't that easily make the choice yourself. You cannot build your own cycle path. And I don't think we get enough studies that look at these things and also see how hard it is to shift things. The fastest way to become very equal is to lose a war, and the fastest way not to become equal is to be a world power. And you're stuck with those legacies. Lastly, some maps for the geographers who might be upset that I didn't show any about where we're going, and something outside of the rich world. This is the Nile. This is a aerial photograph of the Nile taken recently, which shows how much light pollution there is. So we're going to take that image, we'll do it for the whole world. And this is what the sky at night looks like for the whole world. The difference, you've seen this image many times before, you've just never seen it on this projection before. You're now looking at it on a population cartogram. We've got an equal population density going on there. We are here. And the Sahara's here, because I don't like physical geography. We've made the deserts disappear, the mountains disappear, and if there are lots of people in a place, we've made it bigger. So suddenly, the image that used to tell you where people were is now telling you where there are people who are so profligate they can afford to shine light up into the sky. And then in the dark areas, it's either people who don't have enough electricity to do that, or people who are so sensible that they're actually shining light downwards to read rather than upwards. And you do get changes. I haven't got enough time to show you the change, but Tokyo is a fascinating one that's become less bright since they turned off a quarter of their electricity supply. You have wonderful, this is part of my saying, what a wonderful time to be a social scientist is living in a time of massive rises in poverty, but you're going to get to measure the effects of that if you're interested. And a tsunami, which is terrible, also tells you what happens if you cut a quarter of your power. And the world doesn't end. You turn some lights off and you only use a lift if you're in a wheelchair. That's what happened in Tokyo for a bit. Final 2 pictures. Again, just a way of seeing the world differently. Then please think of a question to ask me. Here we've done the same thing, and we've taken out the oceans. So this is an inset of a map of the world showing what population looks like, but taking out the oceans. One of my favourite bits of my PhD, I had a quote from a physicist called Rudy Rucker about time and space work in the 1970s, who said that the sense of time was only a feeling that you get from being a certain kind of space-time being. And hey man, if you can just step back from it and look differently, it's not quite like that. And I've never escaped the idea of trying to look at things differently, in a different way, to see how it feels different. And when you create this kind of map, suddenly we're no longer in the middle of the map. We're about 1% of the world's population at the moment, a bit less. We have 0.5% of the world's children, so we're heading to shrink dramatically on that little corner of the world where we're at. But if we're lucky, some more people will come. We've built a lot of sewers and other things. It's a nice place to be. We can do with young people. but we're going to have to get the housing costs down if they're not going to be completely fleeced when they come here. But currently plan A is that my generation will be okay because our pensions will be funded out of the rent that we charge to younger people who will never get to buy any property on their own. And I hope you can do something to change that. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.